The grand ballroom at Windsor Castle buzzed with nervous energy as Camilla Parker Bowles adjusted her pearl necklace for the third time in 10 minutes. Tonight was supposed to be special, a carefully orchestrated dinner where King Charles would formally introduce her children, Tom and Laura, to the inner circle of the royal family. After years of living in the shadows, Camilla believed this evening would mark their acceptance into the monarchy's embrace. Charles stood near the ornate fireplace, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the guests arrive. The Archbishop of Canterbury, several dukes and duchesses, and key palace advisors filled the room with polite conversation and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Everything appeared perfect on the surface, but beneath his composed exterior, the king wrestled with doubts that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Earlier that afternoon, a heated meeting in his private study had left Charles questioning everything. His most trusted advisor, Sir Clive Alderton, had presented him with a thick folder containing intelligence reports about Tom Parker Bowles' business dealings and Laura Lopez's social media posts that had caught the attention of palace security. The contents weren't scandalous by ordinary standards, but in the fishbowl existence of royalty, every connection and every comment could become ammunition for critics. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive had said, his voice heavy with concern, "we must consider the long-term implications of fully integrating the Parker Bowles family into official royal functions. The public's acceptance of the Queen Consort has been gradual, but extending that acceptance to her children presents new challenges." Tom Parker Bowles, a successful food writer and critic, had built his career independently of his mother's royal connections. His restaurant's reviews were respected, his cookbooks sold well, and he had carefully maintained a reputation separate from the royal drama that had surrounded his mother for decades. Yet the intelligence report highlighted his business partnerships with individuals who had previously criticized the monarchy, and his occasional appearances at events that could be construed as anti-establishment. Laura Lopez, an art curator and mother of three, had always been even more private than her brother. She rarely spoke about her famous stepfather and had successfully carved out her own identity in London's art world. However, recent social media activity from her teenage daughter had raised eyebrows at the palace. Comments supporting various political causes and sharing posts critical of traditional institutions had been noted by the Royal Protection Unit. Charles paced his study that afternoon, torn between his love for Camilla and his duty as king. He remembered the promises he had made to her during their long courtship, promises that her family would be welcomed, that they would never again feel like outsiders looking in. Yet the weight of the crown felt heavier than ever as he contemplated the potential consequences of fully embracing the Parker Bowles clan. The Queen Consort entered the ballroom with Tom and Laura flanking her sides. She wore a stunning midnight blue gown that complemented her silver hair, and her smile radiated the confidence of a woman who believed she was finally home. Tom, handsome in his tailored dinner jacket, chatted easily with a young duke about sustainable farming practices. Laura, elegant in emerald green silk, discussed contemporary art with the wife of a prominent politician. To any observer, the scene appeared to be unfolding exactly as planned. The family looked natural together, their conversations flowed smoothly, and even the most skeptical courtiers seemed charmed by Tom's wit and Laura's intelligence. Camilla caught Charles's eye across the room and smiled warmly, silently communicating her gratitude for this moment of acceptance. But Charles found himself studying the faces around the room with new eyes. He noticed the forced smiles of certain advisors, the way conversations seemed to pause when Tom or Laura approached, and the subtle positioning of security personnel that suggested an underlying tension he hadn't noticed before. The folder from Sir Clive seemed to burn in his memory as he watched his stepchildren navigate the social minefield of royal protocol. As dinner was announced, Charles made a decision that would alter the course of the evening and potentially change his relationship with Camilla forever. Instead of offering his arm to escort the Queen Consort into the dining room as protocol dictated, he approached the Archbishop and began an animated conversation about upcoming church ceremonies. The slight was subtle but unmistakable to those familiar with royal etiquette. Camilla's smile faltered for just a moment as she realized her husband was deliberately avoiding the formal escort that would signal his full support for the evening's purpose. Tom and Laura, less versed in the intricate dance of royal signals, continued their conversations obliviously, but several sharp-eyed courtiers immediately understood that something had shifted. The dinner proceeded with painful politeness. Charles made polite conversation with his stepchildren, but avoided the warm, familial interactions that Camilla had hoped to showcase. When Tom shared an amusing story about a disastrous restaurant review, Charles managed only a thin smile instead of the hearty laugh the tale deserved. When Laura mentioned her daughter's upcoming art exhibition, the king responded with a non-committal comment about supporting young artists rather than the enthusiastic endorsement of a proud grandfather. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had grown noticeably strained. Camilla found herself overcompensating, laughing too loudly at jokes, and asking pointed questions designed to highlight her children's accomplishments. Her efforts only served to make the king's coolness more apparent by contrast. The evening that was meant to celebrate family unity instead became a masterclass in royal rejection, executed with such subtle precision that those outside the inner circle might miss it entirely. But, for Camilla, watching her carefully laid plans crumble beneath her husband's polite but unmistakable distance, the message was crystal clear. Her children were not welcome in the heart of the monarchy. The morning after the disastrous dinner, Clarence's house felt like a battlefield where no shots had been fired, but casualties were everywhere. Camilla sat in her private sitting room, still in her silk dressing gown at 11 o'clock, staring out at the gardens where she and Charles had once walked hand in hand, planning their future together. The cup of Earl Grey on the table beside her had grown cold hours ago, untouched since her lady-in-waiting had brought it. Charles had left early for a previously scheduled visit to a children's hospital in Manchester, departing without their usual morning conversation over breakfast. His absence spoke louder than any argument could have. In 30 years of knowing each other, through scandal and separation, public humiliation and private reconciliation, he had never simply vanished without explanation. The Queen Consort's phone buzzed repeatedly on the mahogany side table. Tom had called 3 times, his messages growing increasingly concerned. Laura had sent a series of text messages asking if everything was all right, and whether she had somehow offended the king. But Camilla couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she explain that the man who had fought the world to marry her had just publicly rejected her children? In his private office at the palace, Sir Clive Alderton was fielding a very different kind of crisis. The guest list from the previous evening included some of the most connected people in British society, and whispers about the king's behavior were already circulating through London's elite social circles. 3 separate courtiers had called before 9 o'clock, asking delicate questions about whether there had been some kind of family disagreement. The king seemed rather distant last night, observed Lady Pemberton, the wife of a prominent conservative politician, during her call to Sir Clive. Is everything quite well with the royal family? Sir Clive had perfected the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. His Majesty was simply focused on his duties as host to such distinguished guests, he replied smoothly. You know how seriously he takes his role in bringing together important figures from across British society. But, even as he deflected inquiries, Sir Clive knew the situation was spiraling beyond simple damage control. The intelligence report that had triggered the king's change of heart contained information that went deeper than social media posts and business connections. Intelligence services had flagged potential security concerns related to some of Tom's restaurant investors, including indirect connections to individuals who had previously been investigated for tax evasion schemes. More troubling were reports about Laura's art gallery connections to collectors who had been linked to money laundering operations. While neither Tom nor Laura was suspected of any wrongdoing, their proximity to these individuals created potential vulnerabilities that the palace security team deemed unacceptable for full royal family members. The king had spent hours in his study after returning from Manchester, reading through additional files that painted an even more complex picture. Tom's food writing had taken him to countries with complicated relationships with Britain, and his professional relationships included chefs and restaurateurs whose political views ranged from Republican sentiments to outright anti-monarchy activism. Laura's art world connections were similarly problematic from a security perspective, with several collectors and dealers having histories of supporting causes that challenged traditional British institutions. Charles understood that none of this made Tom or Laura bad people. In different circumstances, he might have admired their independence and their refusal to trade on royal connections for professional advancement. But, as king, he had to consider not just their character, but their potential to become lightning rods for criticism or security risks for the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, at her London home, Laura Lopez was experiencing her own crisis of understanding. Her husband, Harry Lopez, had noticed her distress immediately when she returned home the night before. Over breakfast, she had tried to explain the evening's strange atmosphere while their 3 children chattered about school and weekend plans, oblivious to their mother's turmoil. It was like watching someone I'd known for years suddenly become a stranger, Laura confided to Harry as they stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the normal chaos of family life. Charles has always been kind to me, even during the worst times with Mummy's divorce and all the publicity. Last night, it was as if I didn't exist. Harry, who had observed the royal family dynamics from his position as a successful businessman married into their orbit, had suspected something like this might eventually happen. The pressure on him must be enormous, he suggested gently. Maybe this isn't about you or Tom personally. But Laura struggled to find comfort in explanations that didn't address the fundamental hurt of rejection. She had never sought to capitalize on her connection to the royal family, had raised her children to understand their unique but complicated position, and had always supported her mother's relationship with Charles even when it cost her personally in terms of privacy and normal family experiences. Tom Parker Bowles was having a similar conversation with his own family, but his response was markedly different. As a successful author and food critic who had built his reputation entirely separate from royal connections, he felt more anger than hurt. His wife, Sarah, listened as he paced their kitchen, describing the subtle snubs and calculated coldness he had witnessed. If Charles doesn't want us in his royal circle, that's perfectly fine with me, Tom declared, though the hurt in his voice contradicted his words. I never asked to be part of this circus anyway. I've spent my entire career proving I could succeed without royal connections, and I'm certainly not going to beg for acceptance now. But even as he spoke defiantly, Tom couldn't ignore the implications for his mother. He had watched Camilla fight for decades to find her place in the royal family, enduring public hatred and media persecution with remarkable grace. The idea that her happiness might be threatened by Charles's rejection of her children filled him with a protective fury he struggled to contain. The palace staff, trained to read the subtle signs of royal displeasure, began adjusting their behavior accordingly. Invitations that might have included Tom or Laura were quietly revised. Security briefings that had begun to include the Parker Bowles family were scaled back to cover only the Queen Consort. The machinery of royal exclusion, refined over centuries of practice, began operating with silent efficiency. By the end of the week, the message was clear throughout the royal establishment. While Camilla remained beloved as Queen Consort, her children were to be treated with polite distance rather than familial warmth. The silence that followed the dinner party became a roar of unspoken rejection that would reshape the dynamics of the royal family forever. 3 weeks after the infamous dinner, the silence between Charles and Camilla had evolved from uncomfortable to unbearable. They maintained their public appearances with professional precision, attending state functions together, hosting diplomatic receptions, and fulfilling their royal duties as if nothing had changed. But, behind the scenes, their private life had become a careful dance of avoidance and unspoken accusations. Camilla found herself questioning every interaction, analyzing every word Charles spoke for hidden meanings. When he complimented her dress before a charity gala, she wondered if he was overcompensating for his coldness toward her children. When he asked about her day, she searched his expression for signs of genuine interest or mere obligation. The easy intimacy they had shared for decades seemed to evaporate like morning mist. The breaking point came during a quiet Sunday afternoon at Highgrove House. Charles was in his beloved garden, tending to his organic vegetable patch with the focused attention he usually reserved for matters of state. Camilla watched him from the conservatory window, noting how peaceful he looked among his plants, more relaxed than he had appeared in their shared presence for weeks. She made her decision and walked out to join him, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth of the garden path. Charles looked up as she approached, and, for a moment, his face showed genuine warmth before the shutters came down again, replacing affection with polite acknowledgement. "Charles, we need to talk," Camilla said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This silence is destroying us, and I deserve to know why my children have suddenly become unwelcome in your life." Charles straightened slowly, wiping soil from his hands with a gardening towel. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his years. "Camilla, you know how much I care for Tom and Laura. This isn't personal." "Then, what is it?" she demanded, her usual diplomacy abandoning her. "Because from where I stand, it looks very personal indeed. You went from planning to welcome them into the family to treating them like strangers overnight. What changed?" Charles struggled with how much to reveal. The intelligence reports contained sensitive information that he couldn't share entirely, but Camilla's pain was becoming impossible to ignore. There are security concerns, he said finally. Connections and associations that could put the monarchy at risk if Tom and Laura become more publicly associated with the royal family. Camilla felt her anger flare. Security concerns? Tom writes about food, Charles. Laura curates art exhibitions. They're not international criminals. It's not about what they do, Charles replied, his own frustration beginning to show. It's about who they know, who they work with, and how those connections could be exploited by people who want to damage the crown. The Prime Minister's office has already flagged potential issues. The mention of political involvement made Camilla's heart sink. She understood the delicate balance between the monarchy and elected government, but the idea that politicians were influencing family decisions felt like a betrayal of everything she thought their marriage represented. So you're choosing the institution over the people you claim to love? She said quietly. Just like you did with Diana. Just like your mother did with Margaret. The crown always wins, doesn't it? The comparison to his first marriage hit Charles like a physical blow. That's not fair, and it's not accurate. Diana's situation was completely different. Was it? Camilla challenged. Or are you just repeating the same pattern? Sacrificing personal happiness and family loyalty for the sake of appearances and political convenience. Their argument was interrupted by the approach of a protection officer, who maintained a respectful distance but whose presence reminded them both that even their most private moments were observed and potentially recorded. Charles gestured toward the house, and they moved their confrontation indoors. In the privacy of Charles's study, surrounded by centuries of royal portraits and the weight of institutional history, their argument continued with increased intensity. Camilla detailed every slight, every moment of coldness that had wounded not just her but her children. Charles defended his position with constitutional precedents and security briefings, but his arguments sounded hollow even to himself. You promised me, Camilla said, her voice breaking. When we married, you promised that my family would be your family. You said we had waited long enough to be together, that nothing would come between us again. Charles sat heavily in his leather chair, suddenly, looking every one of his 75 years. I meant every word when I said it. But being king has taught me that personal promises sometimes have to be weighed against public responsibilities. Public responsibilities or political cowardice? Camilla shot back. Because from what I can see, you're letting faceless bureaucrats dictate who you can love and accept as family. The truth was more complicated than either of them wanted to admit. The intelligence reports had revealed connections that were genuinely concerning from a security perspective, but they had also provided Charles with an excuse to distance himself from a situation that had always made him uncomfortable. Deep down, he had never fully embraced the idea of being a stepfather to adult children who had their own established lives and loyalties. Tom and Laura represented a reminder of Camilla's life before him, of relationships and bonds that existed independent of his influence. Unlike his own sons, who had been shaped by royal protocol from birth, Tom and Laura brought outside perspectives and connections that challenged the insular world of monarchy. The children know, Camilla said suddenly. Tom called yesterday. He said he's withdrawing from any public events that might embarrass the royal family. Laura has declined an invitation to a gallery opening because she's afraid her presence might reflect poorly on you. Charles felt a stab of guilt at the pain in Camilla's voice. I never asked them to withdraw from their lives. You didn't have to, she replied. Your message was clear enough. They're protecting me from having to choose between them, and you by making the choice themselves. The conversation ended without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Camilla understood that her husband's first loyalty would always be to the crown, while Charles realized that his decision had cost him more than just his stepchildren's presence. It had damaged his relationship with the woman he had fought the world to marry. That night, they slept in the same bed for the first time in weeks, but an ocean of unspoken resentment stretched between them. The silence that had begun with a rejected dinner invitation had evolved into something that threatened the very foundation of their marriage, and neither of them knew how to bridge the gap that had opened between personal love and public duty. The ripple effects of Charles's rejection began spreading far beyond the walls of Clarence House, reaching into corners of British society that the king had never anticipated. 6 weeks after the fateful dinner, the first public crack in the royal facade appeared in the most unexpected place, a Food and Wine magazine interview with Tom Parker Bowles. The interview had been scheduled months earlier to promote Tom's latest cookbook, a celebration of traditional British cuisine with modern twists. The journalist, Sarah Henderson, was known for her gentle approach to celebrity interviews, typically focusing on recipes and restaurant recommendations rather than personal drama. But Tom's demeanor during their lunch meeting was noticeably different from his usual warm, engaging persona. "You seem a bit distracted today," Sarah observed as Tom pushed his lamb around his plate without really eating. "Is everything all right?" Tom looked up, and, for a moment, Sarah saw past the public figure to a man dealing with private pain. "You know, Sarah, people assume that being connected to the royal family is all glamour and privilege. But sometimes it means learning that family relationships can be more fragile than you ever imagined." Sarah's journalist instincts immediately perked up. "Are you referring to anything specific?" Tom hesitated, aware that his next words could create headlines across the world. "Let's just say that blood family and royal family don't always blend as smoothly as people might hope. Sometimes institutional concerns take precedence over personal relationships." The resulting article, published 2 weeks later, was carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations while making the subtext unmistakable. Tom's quotes about institutional concerns and fragile family relationships were buried in the middle of an otherwise standard celebrity profile, but royal watchers immediately understood the significance. Within hours of the magazine hitting newsstands, palace phones were ringing constantly. Royal correspondents from every major British newspaper were requesting comment on Tom's statements. The palace's standard response, "We do not comment on private family matters," only fueled more speculation. At Clarence House, Camilla read the article with a mixture of pride and anxiety. She was proud of Tom for maintaining his dignity while subtly defending their family's position, but she feared the consequences for his relationship with Charles. Her fears proved justified when Charles summoned her to his study that evening. The magazine spread open on his desk. "Did you know about this?" Charles asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I knew Tom was hurt," Camilla replied carefully. "I didn't know he was planning to speak publicly about it." Charles paced behind his desk, the magazine's pages rustling as he gestured toward them. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. The moment we include them in royal functions, their personal grievances become public spectacles." "Their personal grievances?" Camilla's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "Charles, you rejected my children without explanation and expected them to simply disappear quietly. Tom didn't attack you or the monarchy. He simply acknowledged that family relationships can be complicated. He might as well have taken out a full-page advertisement announcing that the king has rejected his stepchildren," Charles retorted. "The newspapers will have a field day with this." Charles's prediction proved accurate. The following morning's tabloids ran variations of the same headline: "Royal Rift Revealed, King Cold Shoulder's Stepchildren," and "Camilla's Kids Cast Out." The broadsheets took a more measured approach, but still analyzed the implications of apparent tension within the royal family. The most damaging coverage came from Republican-leaning publications that used Tom's interview as evidence of the monarchy's inherent dysfunction. "If the king cannot maintain harmony within his own family, what hope does he have of uniting the nation?" wrote one particularly sharp columnist. Meanwhile, Laura Lopez was dealing with her own crisis as the media attention intensified. Photographers had begun gathering outside her children's schools, and reporters were calling her art gallery colleagues asking for comments about her relationship with the royal family. The privacy she had carefully maintained throughout her adult life was evaporating under the glare of unwanted publicity. "This is exactly what I never wanted," Laura confided to her mother during a tense phone call. "I've spent years building a career independent of royal connections, and now that's being destroyed because of family drama I never asked to be part of." Camilla felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. Her marriage to Charles had promised happiness and security after decades of uncertainty, but now it seemed to be destroying her children's peace of mind. "I'm so sorry, darling. I never imagined it would come to this." "It's not your fault, Mummy," Laura said, though her voice carried a weariness that suggested she blamed herself for hoping things could be different. "But I think it's time we all accepted that being part of Charles's life means accepting that we'll never really be family in the way we hoped." The conversation left Camilla feeling more isolated than she had since the darkest days of her relationship with Charles during the 1990s. Then, at least, they had been united in their love against public opposition. Now, the opposition was coming from within, and she felt caught between her loyalty to her husband and her love for her children. Charles, meanwhile, was discovering that his attempt to quietly distance himself from his stepchildren had created exactly the kind of public relations nightmare he had been trying to avoid. Intelligence reports about potential security risks seemed trivial compared to the actual damage being done by headlines questioning his character and fitness as king. Sir Clive Alderton presented the king with a summary of media coverage and public opinion polling that made for sobering reading. The narrative that's emerging portrays your majesty as cold and calculating, he reported. People are drawing comparisons to historical royal family feuds and questioning whether you've learned from past mistakes. What do you recommend? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Reconciliation, your majesty. Public gestures that demonstrate family unity. Perhaps a joint appearance at a charity event or a family photo opportunity. Charles stared out the window of his office, watching tourists gather outside the palace gates. The crowd still cheered when he appeared, still showed respect for the crown he represented, but he could sense a shift in the public mood. The British people had grudgingly accepted his marriage to Camilla after years of resistance, but they would not tolerate what appeared to be cruelty toward her children. And if the security concerns are real? Charles asked. Sir Clive chose his words carefully. Your Majesty, the risks identified in the intelligence reports are theoretical and manageable. The damage to the monarchy's reputation from this family rift is immediate and measurable. That evening, Charles and Camilla attended a state dinner for visiting dignitaries, their public performance of marital harmony flawless as always. But photographers noticed what royal watchers had begun calling the Highgrove distance, the subtle but unmistakable space that had opened between them, both physical and emotional, since the rejection of Camilla's children. The silence that had begun with a dinner party snub was becoming a deafening roar that threatened to drown out everything Charles thought he understood about duty, family, and the delicate balance between public service and private happiness. The crisis reached its crescendo 3 months after the original dinner party, during what should have been a moment of royal triumph, the king's 76th birthday celebration. Traditionally, the occasion would have been marked by a family gathering at Sandringham, with close relatives and cherished friends joining Charles and Camilla for an intimate dinner followed by a larger reception. But, as the guest list was finalized, the glaring absence of Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez spoke volumes about the unresolved tensions within the royal family. Palace staff, accustomed to including Camilla's children in family events, had to make awkward adjustments to seating arrangements and protocol. The birthday celebration that should have showcased royal family unity instead highlighted its fractures. Camilla stood in her dressing room at Sandringham, holding the sapphire necklace Charles had given her for their first anniversary as a married couple. The diamonds caught the light beautifully, but she found herself remembering not the joy of receiving the gift, but Tom's delighted laughter when he had first seen her wearing it. "Mummy, you look like a proper queen now," he had said, and they had all laughed at the impossibility of the statement becoming true. Now she was indeed a queen, but the crown felt heavier than she had ever imagined possible. The woman who had once joked about being the most unpopular person in Britain was discovering that acceptance could be more fragile than rejection, and that happiness earned through decades of struggle could be destroyed by a single moment of institutional cowardice. Charles found her there, still holding the necklace, staring at her reflection with an expression he hadn't seen since the worst days of their courtship. "Camilla," he said softly, "you look beautiful." She turned to face him, and he was shocked to see tears in her eyes, tears she had been holding back for months. "Do I, Charles? Because I feel like I'm disappearing. The woman you fell in love with, the mother who raised those children you've rejected, the person who believed that love could overcome anything. Where has she gone?" The question hit him with unexpected force. In his focus on protecting the monarchy from potential threats and managing political pressures, he had lost sight of the woman whose strength and resilience had sustained him through his darkest moments. "You're still here," he said, reaching for her hands. "You're still the same person." "Am I?" Camilla asked, stepping away from his touch. "Because the person you fell in love with would never have allowed her children to be treated as security risks and political liabilities. That woman would have fought for her family instead of choosing silence to preserve a marriage." Charles realized that his queen consort was telling him something he had been too focused on royal duties to understand. She was considering leaving him. Not publicly, perhaps not even legally, but emotionally and spiritually, she was preparing to withdraw from their marriage to protect herself and her children from further hurt. "Camilla, please," he began. But She held up a hand to stop him. Charles, I need you to understand something. I didn't fight the world to marry a king. I fought to marry the man I loved, a man who valued loyalty and family above everything else. Somewhere along the way, you've become someone who sees my children as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved. The birthday dinner proceeded with excruciating politeness. William and Catherine attended with their children, bringing warmth and laughter that partially masked the underlying tension. Harry's absence was expected and accepted, but the missing presence of Tom and Laura created an awkwardness that even the most skilled royal protocol couldn't smooth over. During his birthday speech, Charles thanked his family for their support and spoke about the importance of understanding one's duty to the nation. But even as he spoke the familiar words about service and sacrifice, he found himself looking at Camilla and seeing not admiration but profound sadness in her expression. After the last guest had departed and the children had been taken to bed, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in the drawing room where they had shared so many happy moments over the years. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows on portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own challenges balancing duty and desire. I've been thinking about the future, Camilla said quietly, settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. About what kind of queen I want to be, and whether that's compatible with the kind of king you feel you need to be. Charles felt fear grip his chest. What do you mean? I mean that I've spent my entire adult life being defined by my relationship to this institution. First as the other woman who threatened it, then as the second wife who challenged it, and now as the queen who must sacrifice her children to protect it. I'm tired, Charles. I'm tired of always being the one who has to choose between personal happiness and public duty. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, covering ground they had avoided for months. Charles explained in detail about the intelligence reports, the political pressures, and the genuine security concerns that had influenced his decision. Camilla listened without interruption, finally, understanding the complexity of factors that had shaped his choice. But understanding didn't erase the hurt or solve the fundamental problem. I appreciate that your position is difficult, she said finally. But my position is impossible. You're asking me to be a queen who doesn't defend her children, a mother who chooses her crown over her family. That's not who I am, and it's not who I want to be. Charles found himself facing a choice that no constitutional law or royal protocol could make for him. He could continue on his current path, maintaining distance from his stepchildren to protect the monarchy from potential risks and political criticism. Or he could choose the woman he loved and the family she brought with her, accepting whatever consequences that choice might bring. What do you want me to do? He asked, though part of him feared the answer. Camilla looked at him with the same directness that had first attracted him decades earlier. I want you to be the man I fell in love with, someone who values people over institutions, who understands that family loyalty is more important than political convenience. I want you to call Tom and Laura and ask them to join us for Christmas. Not because it's politically wise, but because they're family and families support each other through difficulties. Charles sat in silence for long moments, feeling the weight of 76 years of royal conditioning warring with his love for the woman sitting across from him. Finally, he reached for his phone. Tom, he said when his stepson answered. It's Charles. I think it's time we had a proper conversation. Would you and Laura join Camilla and me for lunch this week? We have some family business to discuss. The relief in Camilla's smile was worth whatever political storms might follow. As dawn broke over Sandringham, the king understood that the strongest monarchies were built not on the rejection of inconvenient truths, but on the courage to embrace them and the people who brought them. The silence that had nearly destroyed their marriage was finally broken, replaced by the far more challenging but ultimately more rewarding sound of honest conversation about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family in the modern age.